Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in the second No Talk for the day, titled Uncertainty Deconstructed, Transforming Traditional Perceptions, with Dr. Bruce Garvey, ex-serial entrepreneur, consultant advisor specialized in supporting organizations faced with high levels of uncertainty and complexity. His knowledge base allows him to address user problems and issues at strategic level via a systems thinking holistic approach. Hello.
Hello, hello, Anthony. And well, first of all, to say, thank you, No Talks, for inviting me here today. So it's a great honor to do that. So if when you're ready, you give me the sign and I'll kick off.
Perfect. Just let me start with some announcements when it comes to the interpretation. So this session will be in English. However, Arabic interpretation is available. All you have to do is just click on the globe icon at the bottom of the page and choose Arabic and mute original audio. And for Q&A, we are happy to share the Q&A with Dr. Bruce as we go. Make sure to drop them in the Q&A section. I'll be picking them up and sharing them with our speaker. So, Dr. Bruce, over to you to deconstruct the uncertainty and transform perceptions. Over to you.
Okay. I realize there's a multilingual audience, so I'll try not to speak too fast. And I'll speak at a modest pace, I hope. Well, first of all, I have to say that mankind's always been faced with uncertainty, and as the old saying goes, there are only two certainties in life: death and taxes. Anyway, that's
the
what
taxes effect.
I always kick off. What this book was really about was really to explore in greater detail the concept of uncertainty. It's become very fashionable in future years to talk about uncertainty, whereas previously everybody spoke about risk. And there are quite a lot of misconceptions about uncertainty, which the book really attempts to unravel, or should we say deconstruct. Now, if I can just go over to here. Should that slide be coming up? Okay, that's fine. Now, as Anthony said, that the title of the book is called Uncertainty Deconstructed and trying to transform traditional perceptions, and it is set forward as a guidebook for real people in the real world, for practitioners. I must admit, this was not my first preferred title, but the publisher has a certain, shall we say, style in what they want to represent themselves. So I was semi-obliged to go with this type of a title. If one wants to be more sort of popular with the language that one can use, you've probably seen some of it already. If I can just click here.
So the slides on the screen, they'll be moving also. So the slide delay just for the audience, please.
Could be called Taking the Risk Out of Uncertainty. Now, that is rather a conflicting statement in itself, or, as I often tell people, we should have seen it coming. So many of these uncertainties, people say that it's uncertainty, but in reality, we can look for these things elsewhere. Now, what the book is really about is that uncertainty isn't really uncertainty at all, and it just demonstrates our own shortcomings. So I'll just do these things here. So what I'm actually saying is that as I said, most uncertainty isn't uncertainty at all, but just demonstrates a lack of vision and a willingness to think about the unthinkable. And of course, the unthinkable is not just bad, or there probably people associate it with that, but it can be good, could be very innovative ideas as well. So if we're thinking about the unthinkable, some more. A key aim really has been to change the perceptions of uncertainty as something that doesn't just happen in the future, that we don't have any control over, to a proposition that the majority of future events are foreseeable when seen as what I call as inevitable surprises or unknown unknowns. Now, those two terms are going to be cropping up quite a bit in this presentation, and I'll go into a bit more detail they've not been invented by me, they've been invented by other people, but I've introduced them into my discussion about uncertainty. And of course, there's a whole array of what I would call cognitive biases, behavioral factors, which prevent us from making the effort to think about uncertainty as being treatable. That may come as a bit of a surprise to people, but this is really the main sort of thesis of my book, that we can do better with handling uncertainty. Okay, let's look at some, before I go into look at some common perceptions about oops, hang on, that's moving a bit fast there. The three areas that I'm actually looking at in the book is really to try to break down the components of what uncertainty really is. That's the initial level of deconstruction. The second level is to look at the scenarios and how the various lenses that we look at uncertainty in the real world. And the third, I suppose, area of inquiry is to see how human factors, behavioral factors, influence how we see uncertainty in the real world. So those three, they are distinct, but they always overlap and they interconnect as well. Can we go back? Can I go back 2 slides? So perhaps I need a bit of technical help here. Okay. Let's go back one more slide. No. That's the one. No, I'd like to go back to the previous slide, thinking about the unthinkable. That's the one. Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. As I said, most uncertainty isn't really uncertainty at all, but it just demonstrates a lack of vision and a willingness to think about the unthinkable, as we said, good and bad. Now, the uncertainty, can I go back one again? In most people's opinions, uncertainty is seen as, well, it's vague. I don't really understand it. It's all a bit fuzzy. It scares me. And the question that decision makers always want is, give me a metric, give me a number. And of course, with uncertainty, in most cases, a number, you can produce a number, but that number will be pretty useless in guiding you how you want to treat the future, and particularly the future governed by high levels of uncertainty. Let me get back to here. So let's do a more, that's what we see the common views about uncertainty. So let's look at what I call a more formal, a more theoretical introduction. So I'm going to try and keep, whilst the book is partially theoretical, I'm going to keep this presentation as fairly broad appealing as possible. It's where the order or nature of things is unknown. The consequences, the extent or the magnitude of circumstances for events are unpredictable. And then the third area is that credible probabilities to possible outcomes can't be effectively assigned, if at all. And then finally, it's a situation, and this is really for those of you who are perhaps more mathematically minded, it's a situation where neither the probability distribution of a variable nor its mode of occurrence is known. Okay, you can take that what you will, but that's a more formal way of looking at uncertainty for those people who'd be interested. And it is different from risk. It's very important to do that. Right. What I tend to do when I'm talking about risk is not an uncertainty, is not an uncertainty, risk, and certainty. They are not discrete areas. They merge into one another as we get more information. And it's what I would call a spectrum, the risk spectrum. So on this, excuse my hand, you can see me up here. If we go to the the extreme, if we go to the extreme left, we see this rather fuzzy shape. This is where all the true uncertainties that occur. There's very little data, certainly hardly any quantitative data to make judgments on. And this is really what I would call the heart of the topic. As we get more data, particularly quantitative data, we move into the area of risk. And this can be handled with methods which involve kind of probabilities. We can start assigning probabilities. And one area of caution when we do that, we have to try and be as objective as possible. It's very easy to give subjective possibilities. And that's just a word of warning. And as we get more and more, particularly hard data, quantitative data, then we are looking at levels of certainty. And so I call this the risk spectrum. There is a statement up there that is there to challenge, be a bit provocative, to say that, what do we say here? That about the main difference between uncertainty and risk is that uncertainty can't be quantified, but it can be modeled. And this falls back on a statement which has been said by various economists in the past, and I think a variant of what John Maynard Keynes said, in that it's probably better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. And I've seen loads of papers talking about uncertainty, and they go to incredible levels of mathematical detail to try and numbers to prove that one case is more certain than another. It's fuzzy, it's always changing. By definition, you cannot, I don't believe that you can effectively quantify uncertainty, but as I said, you can model it. Now, if we want to break down sorry, just to get that, is that? Oh no, hang on, I have to go, it's a bit slow in, if we go back a slide, here we are. There should be a big triangle in the middle. Oh no. No. There's no triangle there. Sorry about that. This is again another technical. I like to represent there are two levels. Now, pardon? Okay. Right, okay, yep, here we go again. The first level is where we actually, of the deconstruction, is to break it down into these three main areas. And as I said, they're the structural components. And I do apologize, you can't see a large triangle, which should be appearing in there, which represents the three axes. The second axis is what we call the scenarios. The scenario axis, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then the third, and I think the most crucial thing, axis, is the behavioral factors, and these are cognitive biases, and all the nasty things that we humans bring to the problem. Now, they're not isolated in themselves, they all interconnect, and that's why with the triangle you can get them interconnecting one way or another. So there are combinations of issues that come out of this particular simple model of deconstruction. Now, in the book itself, I go into a bit more detail as to how to deconstruct it, and if I can just bring the next slide up here. Yeah, here we are. So if we look at the top axis, the structural components of uncertainty, there, in fact, I'll bring these up so I don't have to keep on interrupting, and I'll talk these through if you don't mind. That's it, okay. So we look at the uncertainty across the risk spectrum, and what happens here, I just expand on that graphic which I showed a little while ago, talking about the differences between uncertainty and risk, and there are considerable areas of that one, and I look at different interpretations that different academics have applied to the idea of uncertainty. I then look at what we call the problem status. Now, not all problems are the same. Some are very easily solved, and what we would call a puzzle, crossword puzzle, and that is the simplest of a problem. Then we have a problem bit more complex and difficult. And then we have the most obtuse of them all, called wicked problems. And wicked problems was a term developed by some urban planners in the early 70s. In essence, wicked problems, they're constantly mutating. The people who are involved, the stakeholders, are contributing to part of the problem. And in most cases, a wicked problem cannot be solved. I should add, this is slightly flippant. There's even a term being called a wicked problem. A super wicked problem, and that is where the people trying to solve the problem are themselves part of the problem. So, just take it that we're really working in the area of the wicked problem, but also be aware that not all problems are the same. And then go look at what we call time-based criteria. And of course, time, as we move forward, we might think of it as linear, but uncertainty looks at issues of asymmetry of events occurring. We're looking at exponential events, particularly in technology at the moment. Areas ago, the timeframes we have to have a look at are very exponential. And in the book, I give some examples of how people have wrongly predicted the number of electric cars, should we say, in 10 years' time as to the actual reality that took place. There's various examples like that. And then, of course, we have cycles, trends, and megatrends. So this is what I call time-based criteria, which are all part of the topic. The next section, I come to the evidence base itself. Again, when we're looking at moving forward, a lot of people look at the information that they have historically or up to now and assume that all that data is correct. When you're looking at the evidence base, you have not only got to look at people's ideas and visions about the futures, but also where they've come from. Is the evidence base they're working on absolutely true? Just again, another little story. I'm in the middle of reading a book by Carolyn, I think her name is Elkins, and it's a book about the British Empire, and it's called Legacy of Violence. Now, being a Brit, I've been brought up and saying how wonderful the British Empire has been. This book really digs into, should we say, a history which we should have known about, but we have not known about. So, as I said, it's important when we're looking at the evidence base to go and dig. You can't make effective forecasts and predictions about the future unless you're starting from a very solid base. So this evidence base is absolutely crucial when looking at uncertainty. And then finally, in this section, I talk about ways of seeing the future. There are different ways. We're talking about forecasting, which again tends to extrapolate what we know at the moment. And then we're looking at futures and foresight, which takes a much kind of freer form look at the future, and is more exploratory and I think more exciting. The danger is too often people take this forecasting view and they extrapolate in a linear process, assuming that what is going to happen in the future is going to happen in the past. And many of those attitudes are actually caused by behavioral and cognitive biases, which I'll come to in a minute. The second section of the book, main section, if I can just, here we are, is what I call scenarios and their role in dealing with uncertainty. Now I look at two main areas here, the reactive and the exploratory scenarios. Reactive scenarios are scenarios we're trying to project into the future, which are based on an event that has already happened. And of course, the thing that's affecting the world at the moment, or certainly has over the last two years, has been COVID-19. And therefore, what people are looking for here is really to take that as an event that's already happened and then project that forward. So we're looking at scenarios dependent on or reacting to an event that has already occurred. Now, the most important part of looking at scenarios is what I call the exploratory approach. And that's really where you're not governed by any one specific event, but you've kind of got free rein to really look at whatever's going out there in the future. And this is really what most people should be looking at, as opposed to just waiting after the event and then trying to come up to look at some scenario-based solutions. And it does invite the futures analyst with a great scope of an ability to explore what is going on in the future. It's very exciting. The second part of the behavioral areas, I don't just, oops, sorry, I'm coming up here. Isn't just looking at these first level scenarios, but what I call spin-offs or derivatives. And I call these second and third level scenarios. For example, if we take the COVID-19, the issues weren't just all about health. There were subsidiary impacts such as on the economy, on the education system, on social mobility, and so on. You can go on. So it's very important to look at some of these derivatives which might occur, and in time, they themselves could be the most important impact or event that comes out of a previous event. So that's where I talk about scenarios. And the third line is my favorite topic, behavior. Now, when I was writing this book, I didn't actually start with this section. I was just really looking at those first two items. But more and more, I became aware that the biggest barrier to looking at the future and looking at what I would call objective evaluations of the future, it's us. And of course, we're looking at a whole range of cognitive biases such as groupthink, heads in the sands, not invented here syndrome, confirmation bias, and there's a whole gamut of behavioral items which govern how we react and how we think about things which are uncertain. We also talk about there's an area called cognitive dissonance, and we can also talk about areas such as anomie, which was originally developed by sociologist Emil Durkheim, and alienation, which of course has which originally came out of Karl Marx, but we're looking at social alien. Anomie and alienation are very similar, but there are quite subtle differences, which I won't go into now, but I do go into in the book. And then the final chapter here is where we look at, having identified these various biases, these cognitive biases and behaviors, we look at ways certain people have looked to mitigate. And when I say mitigate, you never get rid of these biases and subjectivity, but you can find ways of mitigating that. And I wasn't going to say this, but I can say this now, that Finland as a country has been exceptional at exploring areas of cognitive bias and the impact on its young people, and they've done this at the secondary school level and upwards. So I do spend some time on looking at the Finnish experience as an interesting case study here. Okay, right, nearly the end. Right, if you don't mind, I'm going to do my weather forecasting bit now, because it might make it easier. I'm really going to be talking about, when we talk about uncertainty, we talk about the known and the unknown. And many of you will have probably heard Donald Rumsfeld's famous Department of Defense subject when he spoke about this back in 2002. So we have two main variables, the known and the unknown. And this lends itself very easily to the classic 2x2 matrix. So we have the known known, we have the known unknowns, and we have the unknown unknowns. Now, generally, this is what Rumsfeld, he introduced those three areas here, but he didn't actually mention the unknown knowns. I'm going to go into a bit more detail because I think this is the most crucial area. So please bear with me a moment. Now, what we've got here, we have the predictable elements, which these are things we think we know which can occur, and these are identifiable. We actually have identified specific events which could appear in the future. Now, in Quadrant One, this is the known knowns. I know what I know, and this is through, we've got validated data, we've got formal and tacit knowledge, so we can be comfortable with our decision making in this area. Over here, we have the known unknowns, which is I know what I don't know. Now, and these are what Peter Schwartz, again in the early 2000s, called inevitable surprises. And this is where back in the 2000s, following the 9/11 event, we were told in the UK that, you know, there will be some form of terrorist event happening. And sure enough, in 2005, we had the London bombings on the buses and the underground. And there were other factors. We know Vesuvius is well overdue from blowing up again. It hasn't done for a long time. And what is good about this, we don't know when it's going to happen, but we do know something will happen, possibly even in a particular area. So we can call these inevitable surprises. They will happen. They could happen tomorrow. They could happen in 5 years' time. This gives us the chance, and decision makers and policy makers, the chance to actually start developing what I would call contingency plans. Doesn't make to say that the contingency plans will mitigate all the impacts of an event once it happens, but at least you've got some concept of, you've got some level of mitigation which can occur. And then I'm going to go, it might seem illogical, I'm going to go to Quadrant 4, which was the one that Rumsfeld referred to and everybody talked about now as an unknown unknown, which is effectively, I don't know what I don't know. And people, this is the area that people will call black swans. Now, I get very uncomfortable when people talk about black swans. If we don't know what we don't know, then we don't know it. Now, I'm going to give you a possible example of something that might think about and saying this is an unknown known. What about if we get hit by a small meteorite which is contaminated with some organic bug which lands on Earth and causes a worldwide terrible pandemic? It's not an unknown unknown because I've already thought about it. A science fiction writer can actually think about this topic. So I think this unknown known is an overused term, and it's used by people to absolve themselves from, should we say, behavior which they should have identified in the first place. Now, where all the real mess occurs, and we'll come probably, this will lead me into really saying what the book really aims to do, is this Quadrant 3, this unknown knowns. It's kind of a flip of the Quadrant 2. And I define this as being, I don't know what I know. There's an awful lot of stuff out like that, but we just choose to ignore it. Or I think I know, but turns out I don't. Now, this is the area which is where we humans mess up. It's all about hubris, groupthink, head in the sands, amnesia, you name it. All the sins that we do, it happens in this area. And I call these pseudo black swans. And it's really down, we can identify everything really should be in there. This we can ignore. This is where the messes occur. And the argument, the prime argument in my book is to try to get people to be aware of their behavioral short, and it's not just individuals, we're talking about organizations and even nations, of their actual behavioral shortcomings, and to move into this area. So we won't get rid of uncertainty completely. We can never do that, but we can develop a mitigation rules. Of course, we still have to put uncertainties into a hierarchy. And as I said, the main theme of the book is to get people from identifying that the problems they bring to the event or topic and moving them slowly into an area which we can actually have greater control over handling uncertainty. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce, for simplifying this complicated topic. Just let's make sure you're done with this presentation. So now we'll move to some questions that I have prepared. And while listening to this presentation, you've mentioned the asymmetric of events, right? So asymmetric of events would lead to asymmetric information and knowledge. And this in turn would lead to asymmetric decisions, right?
The decisions themselves don't have to be asymmetric. It just means that you have to be aware of what that asymmetry is and then come up with some, not solutions, but at least some, start thinking about what happens in an asymmetric situations. it's no use saying after the event, oh, we didn't know about that. Yes, you could have done. You're just not thinking really hard enough. And that's really what I mean by asymmetry. It's the awareness of asymmetry as opposed to assuming that things will be linear, and therefore what is going to happen in the short term, future term, will be exactly like the past.
So should we linearize the asymmetric?
No. That puts us back into just thinking things are going to be the same as the past.
Yes.
No, we have to embrace these concepts. As I said, uncertainty in some ways is very simple. We should embrace it because it's out there. But on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that it's not that simple, yes. And we have to take in board asymmetry, the events which are all those elements that I've tried to deconstruct. We have to take those on board. And I think the danger is that because uncertainty is complex, people try to oversimplify it and really aren't dealing with the topic professionally enough.
So yeah, thank you for the audience who's dropping their questions in the Q&A. I'm just picking them up from my phone, combining them and relaying them to Dr. Bruce. So how to improve decision-making while avoiding unintended consequences, and how to reduce uncertainty, and is the challenge in the problem identification phase and in generating appropriate solutions?
I would say that the greatest problem was those first of those two questions. You've got to be aware that there are things that you don't know, and therefore you've got to start thinking about these. Now, organizationally, that's all right for an individual, but I think what a large organization doesn't need to do is to have a specialist department whose job is just to think about things that might happen in the future. It affects every single discipline, whether that organization is in the public or private sector. And therefore, you might have the internal consultants. They should be training up every management level to think about uncertainty. Because to say this is what might happen, this is what when, and this is where you get into the area of risk. You've got to do enhanced risk performance in looking at those ones. I don't know whether that's answered the question or not, but I would certainly start by accepting that you don't know what you might find out there. So you have to start with the wicked problem. And structuring that problem is probably the hardest thing in the exercise.
So yeah, so let's move to the weak signals that would allow us to identify the problem. And we've defined weak signals that as early symptoms about a potential mutating trend and below radar information, which can reveal both organizational opportunities and threats. So when it comes to detecting these weak signals, outliers, and fuzzy futures, what did the world do wrong? And is there enough knowledge and signals out there? And can humans, even machines, and the frameworks that you have proposed, such as the morphological analysis, in their current state, disentangle these signals and translate them into actions?
Well, again, the problem is with weak signals is that when you're looking to the future, decision makers tend to concentrate on the strong signals. And because of lack of resources, whether that's time, money, or people to do the task. And therefore, what happens is that they tend to ignore the weak signals, not so much just ignore a weak signal at time -5, but actually weak signals mutate, or they might stay the same, or they can grow and become a strong signals. This requires what I call your management and your forecasting process to. This is not an exercise you do once a year in your annual planning cycle. You've got to be constantly updating your information and evaluating what is going to happen, because things can change like that. And what was a weak signal yesterday could become strong very quickly. On the other hand, you do have the problem of what I would call the boiling frog syndrome. And I think this is what we have for with climate change, which is there's enough information out there to say that these are not weak signals, but we're not reacting fast enough to events which are happening. And of course, those of you who may know the story about, they say if you put a frog in cold water and start turning the tap on, it gets big, it gets warmer and warmer. But because it's such a slow process, it never knows when to jump out, so it gets boiled alive. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of human behavior, which is a bit about that. We don't react until it's actually, we're faced with something which affects us personally. And this is a problem of human behavior. As I said, we knew about what people had said, warnings about COVID-19 chose to be ignored. We knew that the financial crash was happening in 2008 and 9. People like Rubini and Rajam were making these noises, but they were unfashionable. They were ignored. We knew about Putin, and the intelligence services knew about Putin for the last 20 years as some of his behaviors and what was taking place, which was moving. But again, we chose to ignore it because there are other factors which interceded and which were seen to be more urgent. So yes, weak signals, it's a non-stop exercise. You just don't go, oh, we'll spot some weak signals this week, and next week or next month or next year we'll try and spot a few more. No, they're constantly changing. You don't know how they change. That's the excitement of uncertainty. For me, I find that exciting. But as I said, it's a non-stop process, and this is why you do need greater resources within certainly a big organization to be able to carry out that exercise. Because when things happening, the damage of not doing, and we know with climate change, if we do have to react to something really serious, which is likely to happen, it's going to cost us a lot more money than investing in it now. Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience. Should we find certainty in uncertainty or simply embrace uncertainty?
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yes. Should we find certainty in uncertainty or simply embrace uncertainty?
I think you have to find uncertainty in certainty. I think too many people are out there saying this is what we know and therefore we'll develop policy because of that. And then when they dig deeper, well, we don't have all the facts. We don't have all the information. So yes, you certainly have to look for. Do not assume that you're always in quadrant one up there. You have to look at it, and so all the time there are factors that are coming up. Otherwise, what happens? You get too far down that path, and you suddenly realize, oh, we have made a mistake here, and therefore, and it's very difficult to actually go back and start from the beginning again. So I certainly. Don't sit on your laurels, always go back and check the past and see the decisions you made were the right ones. Invariably, they'll probably be wrong in some way. That doesn't matter. It means you're doing the work, you're doing the proper work by identifying the self that you were wrong. Although to some people, particularly politicians, they don't like actually doing U-turns, but I see that as I see doing U-turns as a strength. So yes, you must look at those uncertainties as well.
Perfect. So, like, while people are risk averse in the gain frame, should businesses and governments specifically control the future, or instead of trying to predict it?
I would say that people are risk averse because two things: lack of imagination and fear that they don't want to confront. And they don't want to confront that reality, and that's the greatest danger to human beings, to mankind. But I don't want to be always concentrate on what I would call the negative aspects about uncertainty. Remember, we can be looking. There are methods out there. I haven't spoken too much about methods. I did an exercise a few years ago when there's nearly 1,000 methods to help with decision support, ranging from post-its on a wall to very complex mathematical exercise. So I do introduce a number of methods in the book, but I don't want to talk about that particularly now. But I think that in the case of looking at short, what I'm saying is that there is no one single method. There's often a combination of methods, and there are different problems which require different methods as well. I mean, too often, particularly amongst, okay, I'll probably get slaughtered for this, but too much amongst academics and, should I say, big professional firms, they rely on one particular method, which they exploit ad nauseum. And you've got to be a lot more flexible than that. The world isn't that simple to rely on a one-trick pony. Yeah.
Perfect. So here we have another question from the audience when it comes to technologies.
Yep.
Are the advancements in technologies and social media, big data, artificial intelligence supporting the goal of deconstructing uncertainty?
Some of AI will help us have access to more reliable data. There's no doubt about that. That will help. But I don't actually, if you fall into the trap of saying AI is the only solution, then you're going to be caught short sometime in the future with something unknown coming out, left wing or somewhere that you haven't foreseen. There's the danger of over relying on the algorithm. Now, as I said, they have given tremendous advances, but we cannot assume that always the algorithms are absolutely correct. There can be biases in some of the coefficients which are imported into the algorithms. It comes down to its constant repetition. You can't. That's why I think the old planning cycles are wrong today, because particularly in technology, you are getting exponential leaps. And I think that is the biggest challenge, that if you think that a new device you've invented, it will either fall flat or it could take off in the next 2 years. And yet maybe an investor may think, no, it's not going to happen in 5 years and not give you the money for that one. So, yeah, technology is the hardest area to identify uncertainties, because we don't know which way it's going to turn out. I use the old example, when the one that really took off and got mobile phones going because they were expensive was actually texting. People found out, you could get texting for free, whereas the phone calls were very expensive. And that actually took off. And that wasn't predicted by the manufacturers of the mobile phones when they first started hitting the marketplace. And there are lots of other examples like that.
Yeah, so you've talked a lot about perceptions towards uncertainty, behavioral insights, and so on. So what role should behavioral economics, this new trend, play in decision making, and especially not only decision making at the level of firms, but also policy making? Like, we've seen businesses making use of the behavioral insights in their ads and marketing strategies and so on. But when it comes to governments, policymakers, how could they benefit from this behavioral insights?
I think the behavioural factors are very strong, and in fact a lot of work's been done. Well, you've probably heard of people like Kahneman, who's done a lot of things on cognitive bias, but there's a lot of stuff being done by some former CIA guys, ex-CIA guys, called First and Hoyer. I think Hoyer's now died, unfortunately, but they did a tremendous amount of work on looking at human biases and how it affects people actually to construct a scenario. Just don't think you've got a scenario that's correct. There could well be some biases, whether that's been groupthink in the process to actually establish what the boundaries and the terms and conditions of the scenario. So I think that we are becoming aware of our human frailties, and that we have to be constantly aware of these human biases. More important now that with social media, whilst there's more data out there, we're being pushed into much more self-supporting silos. You'll be targeted because someone thinks exactly the same like you. That's quite nice and that's quite cozy. But on the other hand, if you have a particular one, you're not getting alternate opinions, and you're being driven into a very narrow band of thought. So as I said, I think that the behavioral sciences have helped us to identify some of those issues. And they have become increasingly serious, and to try and overcoming them is exceedingly difficult. But the first stage is to identify that they exist in the first place, and that hasn't been the case. But I think it's starting to come through now.
So building on this question and answer, is our pandemics avoidable? Like, we have seen this the latest pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think if governments, policymakers, and decision makers were making use of this knowledge, massive knowledge out there, and behavioral insights, would they have been able to avoid this pandemic? or act differently? At least?
Well, I think the medical people had always forecast that we can get pandemics, and we've seen Ebola. Okay, that was controlled within a fairly tight population and also a fairly tight geographical area, and we do know that the contingency plans had been made. Most governments in the world, sophisticated governments in the world, have got some form of contingency plans. The failure is to update those contingency plans. It goes into what I call the crisis of the planning cycle. Oh, right, well, we ought to look at that every 2 years because our budget cycle's like, whereas in fact the pandemic can come up within the next week, next month, and so on. So the danger is, with the pandemic is we have got enough medical people out there to say this can happen, and the signals were all there. It was the politicians and the decision makers and the people who are allocated the finance who didn't upgrade the system fast enough. We know, I believe, in this country that we had abundant supplies of the safety equipment, the medical staff, except that by the time we wanted to use it, it was out of date. So sometimes we need all this stuff, but they hadn't actually followed up and got the additional supply in, and therefore you get into panic mode as well. There was also the incidents where I think 2016, there were 16. I do refer to this in the book. There was a government exercise with the health authorities to look at the impact of a major pandemic, and it was so scary that, and in fact, it was effectively suppressed. In fact, the Guardian came out with it, and eventually the government did publish it, but it wasn't until 6 months into the COVID pandemic it actually started in this country. So yes, there is information is out there, but there's this winning are people being told about that, and are people reacting to it, or they're saying no, we don't have the money at the moment, and I'm coming up to an election, and I don't want to start taxing people because we need extra money. I'll wait until after the election and then I'll go for that one. So you've got all, as I said, all these human foibles which mess up the ability to follow up with not just the identification of uncertainties, but how we can overcome some of them. So what I'm saying is we've got to take people from Quadrant 3 back into Quadrant 2. And once it's seen as an inevitable surprise, then you can start developing processes. They may not be good enough, but at least you're doing something, as opposed to saying, oh, this is a black swan event, I couldn't have thought about it in the first place. That's the mindset that we've got to try and eradicate.
Perfect, great. So just to conclude with one final question, I received it from the audience, just I want to tweak it. So we have been failing frequently lately: pandemics, economic crises, inability to reach peace negotiations, social exclusion, digital divide, and so on. But at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, there's a massive amount of knowledge, information, technologies, and so on. So what's not working? Like, if you can just break it down into maybe 3 reasons, causes, barriers, bottlenecks, why?
The problem of prioritizing is still a challenge. You know, which do we put first of that? The second one is actually accepting that such an event might occur. I come back to these behavioral blind spots. You know, oh no, can't think about that, and so on. And I think the third area comes down to people almost giving up. They still like to believe that uncertainties, we're dictated by things that we have no control over, when it really shouldn't be like that at all. And again, those last two are still very much behavioral traits. I think that we can predict in some way most of the events that we call uncertain, is that we're just not, as human beings, ready to accept all the implications that such events might actually inflict upon us.
Perfect. And so we'll conclude with fireside questions, this or that. So just a quick, yes, quick answers. Foresight or forecast?
Foresight.
Uncertainty and certainty, or certainty and uncertainty?
Say that again, sir.
So it's uncertainty and certainty, or certainty and uncertainty?
Certainty and certainty, or I think it's, well, it's probably certain, uncertainty and certainty. You got me going there.
That's a good one. So strategic planning or strategic foresight?
I think strategic foresight is more flexible than the straitjacket of strategic planning. Yeah, but that's just an opinion.
Yes. And this, the last one is from the audience. The metaverse, is it certain or uncertain?
The metaverse, oh, is that certain or uncertain?
Certainly uncertain.
I think it's at that level between what I call Quadrant 2 and Quadrant 3. We have identified some of the risks and what might actually happen in there, but we haven't actually thought about enough downstream that might occur. Yeah, and that's the wonder of uncertainty. We don't have a solution for every particular event that we may want to forecast.
Great. And by that,
but it is a case of just keep watching the space.
so keep watching the space, capturing signals, weak, strong signals, and translating them into decisions. And by that, we reached the end of this session. Thank you so much, Dr. Garvey, for this session. And by that, stay tuned for the book, which will come out in summer, right?
Yeah.
And then by that, we reach out the end of this session, and we'll see you in few minutes, in 10 minutes, with the last session for the day, titled Women in Research, Leading Insight to Action, with Shazia Ginai, and moderated by my colleague, Stephanie Ustani. Stay tuned. Goodbye.